Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3 Iron and today we are taking a timeout from all of our various updates and newsworthy announcements from the GGG team to have a quick discussion on Melee. I thought this was an excellent post from the Cloud Gamer where the tag of his post is "The solution to Melee is not to make Melee skills ranged." I think this is a great topic and so we're going to chat about it today. But before we do that, I had some quick announcements that these finally came in. We're giving away some G3 mouse pads, a G3 hat, and then also some G3 t-shirts. So these finally came in. So thanks so much to all of our Patreon supporters. We're going to be doing a raffle and a random giveaway to a bunch of you that support on Patreon, just as a way to say thank you. So thanks so much to all of you that support on Patreon. Okay, let's jump right into our discussion. First off, the Cloud Gamer says 3.7 was not a Melee league. It was just a patchwork fix for skills with the Melee tag. I totally agree with him, and the vast majority of the player base probably agrees with him as well. Whether or not we as the player base agree with him philosophically, the reality was that 40% of the player base during Legion was playing Cyclone, and about 30 to 35% of the player base was playing some form of ED Trickster or ED something else. So either you can look at it and say, oh, well, the Melee rework was a massive success in 3.7 because Cyclone was so meta. That would be one argument. But another argument would be to say it didn't really fix Melee in general. It might have fixed one particular channeling skill that took advantage of Headhunter for the League mechanic. Therefore, it didn't actually fix all of the rest of the problems that are in existence with Melee. So, Cloud Gamer continues, what is Melee? It might be obvious, but the Melee archetype is a style of combat that is present in most RPGs where the player controls a single character and is also available in a lot of other genres. The primary appeal of Melee combat is to be up close and personal with your enemies, exploiting the way they move to get in strong hits whilst attempting the risk of being within the range for the opponent to do the same. This is an archetype that works exceedingly well in Path of Exile. Skills such as Molten Strike and Double Strike have in the past excelled at damage at the cost of being close to the enemy. I would just add one caveat here. Yes, Molten Strike has been fantastic, but for the most part that was after the invention of Ancestral Call, where you could simply stack the projectiles. So while you were close to an enemy, a lot of Molten Strike builds weren't necessarily that close in comparison with, let's say, a skill like Double Strike. Okay, continuing on with that as a caveat. What is not Melee? So Reeve, Screen Wide Cyclone, Tectonic Slam, etc., etc. That's not to say these skills aren't cool, but they are most certainly not Melee. I also, again, I'm being nitpicky. I would put Molten Strike in that same kind of category, but again, that's just me being nitpicky. The Melee patch of 3.7. 3.7 did most certainly have amazing changes for actual Melee skills in the forms of smoothness of gameplay and damage buffs, especially in the form of flat damage. But ultimately, the primary change was giving Melee more ways to not be Melee. This was very clear in the form of new support gems, weapon range scaling, and more area scaling options on the tree. Yeah, that's pretty cool. This way, my Melee tag skills can also clear screen wide like bow builds and spells. However, that's not the appeal of Melee combat. I think he hits it spot on, right on the head here, right? That the things that Melee can do so far throughout the life cycle of the last year of patching to compete or even just to stay relevant, not necessarily to compete with, but to stay relevant in Path of Exile is to essentially become more and more ranged, to make larger AoEs that hit larger amounts of the screen or that cause chaining effects that then chain throughout the rest of the screen or multiple screens. Even something like an auto bomber build or even last summer's, hot ticket item, which was the Triple Herald Elementalist Blade Vortex build. Yes, it was technically Melee, with the Blade Vortex being a Melee skill, in terms of its range. Yes, it's AoE, but it's very close proximity to you as a character. That build played off of chaining effects, where once something got hit by your actual Blade Vortex, everything else would chain and explode throughout the rest of the build. So even a build like that is very, very Melee is taking advantage of screen clearing effects that are not necessarily Melee in their effect. So Melee in Path of Exile. Actual Melee combat comes with huge consequences and very minor, if any, advantages in PoE. You are forced to take melee hits, projectile attacks are significantly harder to dodge, clear speed is non-existent. Upsides, I don't know. Maybe some forms of life regen are easier to scale, and you can get a lot of DPS with VDS. Okay, so how to actually fix melee. This is one of the reasons why this particular discussion and this particular presentation of this discussion from Cloud Gaming caught my attention, is because, yes, there are hundreds of thousands of people that have written synopsises like this, like the top half of this discussion. However, not many people actually are able to articulate decent, well-meaning, constructive criticism that offers a suggestion. A lot of people can say, hey, this over here sucks. Not a lot of people can say, and here's what we think we should do to fix it. So this is actually a pretty cool approach, and I think it's commendable and ought to be praised and used as a platform to then further springboard the rest of this discussion on how to fix melee. Okay, so this is a tough one. So far, it's clear that melee just sucks in PoE. So why would anyone ever want to play melee? That's right, rather than making a melee ranged, how about incentivizing melee? So how do we do that? I'm not a professional game dev, and I'm certain GGG can think of up more and better ideas, but I pulled some out of my bum, so we can start with these. First off, proximity effects. Proximity effects similar to Pride or Point Blank are actually amazing. They only work if you're actually standing close to the enemy, which inherently makes you stand in melee range. Other types of proximity effects than damage could also be played around with. How about proximity max resistance or increase in aura or armor multiplier? Complete damage reduction in the forms of notables or auras. I love this whole concept of buffing proximity. When I am playing Righteous Fire build, for instance, I often feel like I play melee builds when I'm playing Righteous Fire. Granted, you can scale up the AoE. I often just invest all of my points and all of my stats into life in order to scale up my own defenses and Righteous Fire, because I typically play Righteous Fire in hardcore, where it's like, hey, defenses are everything, and if stuff dies, that's also nice. So I feel like when I'm playing a Righteous Fire build that I'm putting myself a lot of the time in harm's way, or I'm coming very close to putting myself in harm's way, and it's a relatively small AoE when you compare it to bow builds or other spellcaster builds. And I think the proximity bonuses of Righteous Fire are a great template or a great starting point. Pride and Point Blank also being great reference points, right? And I think we see some of these new skills and new gems that are coming along in 3.8 also are giving bonuses for particular proximity effects. I think that's great. But I think more of these sorts of proximity notables or proximity key nodes would be great to scale up the benefits of playing melee. Okay, his second suggestion, give real melee skills bigger numbers. Quote, and then we doubled it, which is a quote back to Chris Wilson referencing when they were developing Delve League, which was the Delve team never thought that, I believe the number was 1,000, was it depth 1,000 or was it depth like 800 or something? That the dev team never thought players would get past that particular level. And so then Chris went into the dev, I think it was 1,500. 1,500 was the number. Because the dev team then presented, hey, we don't think anybody's ever going to get past delve level 1,500. And so they presented that to Chris, and Chris said, okay, well, our players are very ingenuitive, and so then we doubled it. And they made 3,000 the deepest depth. And then, of course, teams broke that, and the rest is history. But anyway, that's where that quote comes from. It's reasonable for something like melee with massive drawbacks to have some sort of inherent advantage. More damage is the obvious choice here. Giving the possibility of great boss damage with minimal investment would be a significant upside. It's also possible to bake survivability or other utility straight into the skills that need it. I think that this is a challenge where the game development team really comes into play. So he's already, Cloud Gaming, the author of this particular post, has already said, hey, look, I'm not a pro game developer, and I think GGG can do a better job. I think this is where GGG has to do a better job. I've said this literally for years now, and you can go back and look through the archives of different videos. I think two-handed weapons ought to simply have more stats available to them than any other weapon in the game. Right? If you're giving up a quiver and a shield or potentially a second weapon, then it's got to be worth it, right? There should just be better stuff on two-handed stuff because of the opportunity cost that you are paying to use that two-handed stuff, let alone the fact that, passives on the passive tree for two-handed stuff doesn't necessarily compete with one-handed stuff when it just comes right down to it in terms of on-point spending efficiency. Setting that aside, just the weapons themselves should be better. So I love the fact that in 3.8 we're getting some of that with staves, how staves as a two-handed slot are going to have some better rolls than are available to one-handed stuff. I think that's a good thing. Thematically, it makes sense, and also competitively and balance-wise, it makes sense. It doesn't mean that everybody's all of a sudden going to start using two-handers because they've got the top-tier numbers on them, right? Because you can still have a better combination for different ascendancies and for different skills to be a one-hander, to do this sword and board thing, right? To be a one-hander plus a shield. Or if you're a bow user, of course you're going to use a bow plus a quiver. You're not going to swap over, right? Or if you're a spellcaster and you need to dual wield, right? Because you really want to stack one particular stat that maybe inherently there are higher numbers on a staff or on a two-handed weapon, but maybe there are specific numbers that you want to roll that are working in conjunction with one another as a dual wield setup that wouldn't necessarily work as well on a two-handed setup, right? Those are ways to make each of these different weapon types more niche and more targeted for specific power spikes of skills. This is where a two-handed skill is going to shine because straight up it's maybe targeted for two-handed weapons and it's got better numbers on it, right? This is where the dev team comes in. And it's easy for us, again, to sit back and say, oh, well, this is where the dev team comes in, and oh, GGG, why don't you just make two-handed stuff better, and why don't you make melee better? Again, I think this is why this particular conversation is a good conversation to have, because there's actual feedback that's saying, hey, here's a suggestion, can you guys go and run with this? You guys are way, way smarter and know the game inside and out. Is this something that's doable? If it's not, fantastic, but is this something that's a platform that we can springboard off of? The third particular suggestion from Cloud Gaming: strike skill specific things. Man, I wish he could have written that differently with less S's. Notables and support skills that are incredibly powerful but only work with strike skills should be available. If there are specific strike skills that benefit too much from these, the tag can just be removed so they don't benefit from it. Things like instant leech, life on hit, damage multipliers, attack speed, etc. all are good options here. I think this is a great idea. Imagine if Volpact, way back in the day, right? Those of us that have been playing for a long enough time that we remember when Volpact's leech was instant and it wasn't terrible, and Volpact was the meta everywhere. Everybody was grabbing Volpact no matter where you were on the tree. Imagine if there were static strike skills, right, that simply gave you old Volpact, right, like the old Ascendancy, right, or not Ascendancy, the old Keynode, right? Imagine if that was there. Or imagine if, for instance, they ever do an update to Elemental Overload or Elemental Equilibrium, and they say, you know what, we're going to nerf these, we're going to change these, we're going to move these around. Imagine if essentially those old overpowered things were then migrated or moved as a game mechanic onto specific weapon types or specific skill types that are underused or are simply underpowered. I think there are ways in which GGG, which is known for reusing their own assets and reusing concepts that they've used in the past, but having a slight twist or a slight tweak on it, the jazz development style of gameplay development. I think those are all things that are available for skills that right now simply aren't going to be competitive. Sweep, reave, cleave, like these are all skills that right now you just have to scale up the AoE on it in order to really play these suckers, as opposed to, hey, maybe Shattering Steel shouldn't have a bug that it shotguns. Maybe that should be a feature, and we need to build on that and build more skills that do something like that. That could be Shattering Steel sort of thing. Again, that's not a melee playstyle. But taking something that's a mechanic that maybe isn't necessarily intended and then expanding on it, right? Take something like, let's say, just a ton of bleed. What if we just had a skill that was just like, hey, every single hit from this thing makes everything bleed. You essentially get a massive DPS support because you no longer need to use bleed support, right, in order to make this thing actually tick off on bleeds. And then maybe you give it something like maybe increasing the damage that you would get from all other nodes that increase bleed. Like maybe it converts bleed chance to simply bleed damage, right? There are lots of ways to play around with stats and with mechanics that are already built into the game in order to make some of these skills that are simply lackluster and can't compete or can't even be relevant because they don't screen clear as quickly enough. There's lots of ways to do this. The most simple way to do it, of course, is his suggestion number 2, but I think you could apply this to strike skill specific stuff, which would simply be add a bunch more flat damage. Like, add a bunch more flat damage onto some of these skills that aren't getting played. I know that sounds incredibly boring, incredibly generic, but look at how excited, how many Necro players are excited because we got +2 to all minion skill gems added into the Ascendancy. Right? They took away a bunch of specific, really creative, really interesting, really dynamic sort of stuff on the Necromancer, and they just said, hey, here's +2 to all the minion gems. What do you think of that? Is that good? And now a bunch of people are going to be playing Necro and basically pathing through that node, no matter what they are. If they're playing a Necro and playing a Summoner, they're going to be pathing through that node because it's going to be fantastic. Imagine doing that by simply giving a massive amount of power spike to something that otherwise was lackluster, right? Nobody was running around saying, oh, you know, minion builds were OP and the levels and the scaling that you could get on minion builds were great. No. Now we all are, because there's, you know, essentially a free empower that's just built into the Ascendancy. So imagine if you do that, but with melee skills, you just give a bunch more flat damage, and then all of a sudden people are going to go, oh yeah, maybe building like flat physical with brutality actually will work, because this one particular melee skill that is a true melee skill gives a bunch of physical damage. And sure, maybe Heavy Strike is a meme, right? That you just walk up and you swing and you chop down the largest tree in the forest with a herring, you know, Knights of Knee style. Okay, fine. But what if you just gave Heavy Strike so much damage that no matter what, it was going to take out whatever it hit with one single strike? Sure, it's got a big wind up. Sure, it's boring, it's slow, it's not screen clearing. But what if it was that strong that it actually made it an appealing skill to use because it blows up whatever it actually hits? I think these are different ways, these are different suggestions to actually make melee better. One quick note on this, none of these suggestions are actually going to come out in 3.8. All of these suggestions that would get made are probably going to be revamped and implemented in 3.9 or 3.10 or 4.0 whenever it is that comes out, simply because GGG are typically 1 to 2 leagues behind on feedback for major development stuff like this. They're typically 4 to 6 months behind the feedback loop, just because it takes that long to build up and to actually work on something. And so this is why, for those of you that wonder, hey, why is it that GGG hasn't fixed this thing that we've been chatting about for a week or a month or even 2 months? Why is it that this hasn't gotten fixed yet? Well, it's because for the development team to shift their priorities to that new thing would mean that the thing that they were working on that was a big complaint point from 6 months ago would get dropped. So that's the practicality of it. So we'll probably see changes and updates to this slowly throughout 3.8 as little incremental development changes are made, but we'll most likely see major changes and major overhauls to Melee in 3.9 and 4.0 in the future. Okay, his too long didn't read. Summary is that Melee sucks, and making skills Melee doesn't change that fact. It just gives us a more homogeneous way of playing the game and doesn't actually fix the fact that the archetype offers nothing compelling. The only way to solve this is to give things that are specific to abilities that are actually used from melee range. Okay, so I've given you some of my thoughts. That's from Cloud Gaming on his thoughts on the solution to melee and how to not make melee boring or simply more ranged, but actually some suggestions on how to fix it. What are your suggestions on how to fix melee? Have you actually played a melee skill? I'd love to hear this from some of you down below in the comments. Have you actually played a melee skill that's a true melee skill, right? There's a lot of us in Guild that have played Tectonic Slam, or that have played Molten Shell, or that have played Cyclone in Legion League. There's a lot of us that did that. But have you actually played a true melee skill and really gotten the feel of melee and how to actually scale that up or change it or adjust it to make it feel better? Leave us a comment down below. Love to have discussions with you all. And as always, I hope that this league, Blight League, is the league when a Mirror of Calandra drops for you. Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.